Underrated teams. I want to start, and I want to tell you our 595 rule, because it has a lot to do with preseason predictions, and it has a lot to do with how people formulate their thoughts, just your overall feelings on a season. It happens around this time of year, even in a COVID-19 year. It still happens this time of year. So think about how it works. You guys have been through this drill just like I have. You end spring ball. In this case, we didn't have spring ball, but in a normal year, you end spring ball, and then next thing is preview magazine season. So you get preview magazines, and then the next thing is media day season. And so you watch the media days from all over the country, and then camp starts, but really nothing's happened. No snap has been taken. No rep has been executed in between those two bookends. Camp opens on the back end and the end of spring on the front end, but so much feels like it happens because so many different people start talking. I'm in that business. I'm certainly not hoping that ever dries up, but the 595 rule is this. This is largely an aggregation business, whether you realize it or not. Not just aggregation in terms of print or content, but aggregation in terms of thought. The 595 rule that I have spoken about for many years is this time of year, a lot of people get married to predictions. And they get married to predictions and they get married to preseason ideas because they hear an overwhelming majority of people whose opinions they value saying the same thing. And that leads you to believe that it must be true. There must be some validity to it. Not always. The 595 rule is really only about 5% of people in this industry have original thought. Only about 5% of people in this industry, we like to fancy ourselves as part of that 5%, are really coming up with anything new. The 95%, either consciously or subconsciously, are just herd mentality. They're just following along. So don't be fooled. Just because a lot of people are saying the same thing, don't be fooled into thinking they must be right. Really, all that's happened is a few people happened to say something, and then a lot of people started regurgitating what those people said. And if you're outside and you're none the wiser to what the difference is, it just looks like, oh, well, this team's a preseason top 10. That means they got to be legit. Not always. And it's not always the case on the other coin, or the other side of the coin, when everyone thinks teams are going to underachieve, everyone thinks teams are going to be parked outside the top 25. Not always. So let's go underrated teams, at least that I've identified this year for myself. Now, this is one I wanted to kick off with, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it because I don't know where I fall on the Washington Huskies. I was listening to Barton and Bud do their podcast the other day, and they were talking about Washington. And it does seem like, as they pointed out, it does seem like quite a few people have written Washington off. It seems like it's an Oregon and or USC world on the West Coast, and not a lot of love to go around anywhere else. This guy, if you're watching the YouTube live version, that is Jimmy Lake. That is the new head coach at Washington, but he's not new to the program. He's been there quite a while. They transitioned, at least defensively. They chose a defensive coach, but they transitioned the same way that Ohio State did with Ryan Day. They already had the replacement in-house. So that automatically tells you there's not the overturning of every bench in the program the way you would normally have if you had a quote-unquote new head coach. So I love Jimmy Lake. I love their defense, and I could have said that long before this year. That's a top 10 unit. The questions that you would obviously have there are replacing quarterback. Now, a lot of people, I've seen a lot of folks questioning their running back depth. I don't worry about that all that much. I think they've got good depth. Remember, question marks aren't always weaknesses. But offensively, how long does it take Washington to get up to speed? What's funny is they play a team that you would describe largely the same way when it comes to offense and how long it's going to take to get up to speed in week one, and that's Michigan. So, if they beat Michigan in week one, all of a sudden I think they're on everyone's radar. So let's just keep an eye on Michigan. But I wanted to dive in a little bit further here to Iowa State. Iowa State is plus. I like to call people plus, neutral, or minus. Plus in these three categories: head coach, quarterback, and defense. They're plus in all three of those categories. And when you're parked in a conference, as they are in the Big 12, where at the very top there's a fair amount of transitioning happening, namely at the quarterback position with Oklahoma, everyone has confidence in Spencer Rattler, but there is transition going on nonetheless. It at least makes you look at a program that you view as being well coached and having some of the very important boxes checked. And here's what else is fun to think about. They're kind of off everyone's radar for the moment, whereas this time last year they were on everyone's radar because they had a down year. Now think previous to Matt Campbell showing up, think about what a down year for Iowa State football would have been. 2-10, 3-9. They went 7-6 last year. An above 500 campaign is now considered a down year. To give you an idea of the overall quality and the elevation that's happening in Ames, Iowa, of the overall stature of that program. So there's a lot to like here still. And I want you to also remember this. Now, the Big 12, it's not set up in divisions. It's just the top 2 teams go to the Big 12 championship game. Think about what they could do. And all you got to do is crack open a magazine and look at their preview and look at their schedule. Look at where they play Oklahoma. There are a couple of landmine games out there. Now, this one's not going to be overlooked, certainly, but they've got Oklahoma in Ames, Iowa. They got them at home. Don't know how many people are going to be there, but they've got them at home the week after Oklahoma plays Texas and the week before Oklahoma plays Oklahoma State. So their Super Bowl could not fall in a better spot in terms of the old let down, look ahead spot. I don't know how much you buy into those scheduling dynamics, but let's keep an eye on Iowa State. Now, that's not a team that's off everyone's radar totally. I'm sure some people will have them preseason top 25. I'm talking about contending for the Big 12 championship, to be clear. That's what I'm talking about them being a contender for. I don't hear many people saying that. Let's talk about the Cal Golden Bears. Let's go out to Berkeley. 2019, from a distance, what do they look like? From a distance, if you were paying attention, hardcore, you saw 8-4. 8-4, nothing to write home about, especially in a weaker conference. What is that good for? What are they, a fringe top 25 team? Yeah, I guess so. And then you zoom in closer, and again, those of you who are hardcore followers of the sport, you know they lost their quarterback, Chase Garbers, last year, and they lost him at the worst time imaginable because they lost him as the meat of their schedule approached, and so they had predictable results during that stretch, and then they got him back towards the end of the year. Also, the schedule lightened up a little bit, and you had to like how they finished last season. But they've got the core of that program built right. Like, they've got a lot of good people coming back, but they've added a lot of good people. They've added a lot of elements, for instance, defensively, that they certainly didn't have before Justin Wilcox got there. I've always been partial to just the overall style of coach he is. So they're also in a conference out there. You talk about Washington not getting a whole lot of love. Well, after you talk about Oregon, after you talk about USC, how many people nationally are talking about Cal? So I'm looking at Cal, and I'm looking at a lot of the boxes that need to be checked. It's an experience year this year. Experience probably matters more than ever. I'm not one that's usually here parroting a bunch of returning starter numbers. But this year, I do care a little bit more about returning snaps. You call it returning starters. I want to know how many snaps you return. Cal returns a lot of snaps. They were the worst team in the Pac-12 in offensive points per game last year. The absolute worst. Nowhere to go but up. That's the way I look at Cal. So I like a lot about what I see from them. And then let's head to the Midwest and let's talk about Nebraska. Yeah. Do you remember this time last year? I remember talking to someone. I remember this vividly. Nebraska was recruiting in an area where I was very familiar with some of the high school coaches. And this is the time last year where a lot of people were fancying them, obviously, as contenders in the Big Ten West. I think a number of people picked them to win the Big Ten West. Now, partly that was out of a shortage of qualified applicants, if you will. But a lot of people thought, hey, year 2, Scott Frost is just going to pop. And I remember them wishing they could pump the brakes on that stuff because they didn't think they were there. Like, internally, they didn't think they were there. I'm not telling you they're running around everywhere off and on the record now predicting national championship year 3 for Nebraska, but I am telling you they feel a lot better about where they are this year. A lot of that has to do, obviously, with a healthy quarterback, hopefully, in Adrian Martinez, but they've also got competition at that position. Whether he's healthy or not, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. Questions, again, are not always weaknesses. But I love picking any team to keep an eye on that the public was a year early on. See, because the public, they get really salty when they predict something and then you don't fulfill their prediction. We've talked about this with Michigan before. It wasn't that they were wrong in their prediction. It was that you underachieved. Isn't that fun, how that works? It's like you're absolved of any wrongdoing no matter what, but you get all the credit if you're right. So in summary, a lot of folks tabbed Nebraska as a sleeper last year. They fall flat. Nebraska, it's your fault, it's not our fault, and now this year, we're not going to pick you to do much of anything. So I will look at them this year. And 2 other things that I want you to keep an eye on. They've recruited pretty well. You could argue they've had the best recruiting class in that division the last 2 to 3 years. You could argue that. It depends on which metrics you want to use. But you could argue that. I would look at defensive back, some of the talent they've brought in that other big-time programs wanted over the last couple of years. I think you'll see some young kids on the field that contribute on the back end of their defense this year. And I also think they've got some skill talent in this last recruiting class, partly from the JUCO ranks and partly just true freshman guys that are going to be better options than the ones that they currently have. They had a notable transfer over the last couple of weeks, but I think that they'll be just fine there. That's the kind of deal where you look and you think there's this massive vacuum when you lose a big time, numerically at least, a big time talent. And then all of a sudden there's this young kid or young kids that come out of nowhere and you say, where'd that kid at Nebraska come from? Pay attention to recruiting. Reason number 1082 to pay attention to recruiting. So those are just some of the teams I'm looking at. And also with Nebraska, before we move on here, I had a little asterisk here written down on the piece of paper. I remember in 2014, I was looking at Mississippi State. And Mississippi State looked like a team that was going to be solid, but their schedule set up to where it was backloaded, severely backloaded. And so I went on radio and I said, I'm telling you right now, we're going to get to week whatever it was, week 7, week 8, Mississippi State is going to be ranked top 10. And you will look around and say, where in the world did Mississippi State come from? And sure enough, they were ranked number 1. They weren't ranked top 10. They were ranked number 1. Now, Nebraska has got a similarly backloaded schedule this year. It reminds me of that 2014 Mississippi State crew. Now, when I say it's backloaded, I mean it is severely backloaded. They got all the Big Ten big boys on the back half. However, until then, if you want to, feel free, be my guest to take some of those derivatives and take some of those prop bets on Nebraska early in the year. I think it could pay off big.